When I was a boy, every Sunday I would go with my family to church. And for me, that church was a massive stone structure that was cavernous on the inside with beautiful stained glass windows that went from the floor to a ceiling that seemed to go to the clouds. It was an incredibly impressive building. To be in it was literally awe-inspiring. I was told that it was the house of God. And boy, it seemed like if God was going to have a house, why, this was a good one because it was so grand. But as I got older, as I grew up and spent years after year in that church every Sunday, I began to wonder if God was ever home. Because I'd also been told that it was a house of prayer. And all of the prayers that I prayed in that house never were answered. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that in terms of understanding how to get answers from prayer, but that's not what I'm going to deal with tonight. It was called a house of prayer, and I understand where that term came from. If you'll turn to Matthew 21, you'll see in verse 13 that that's exactly what Jesus Christ called the temple. In Matthew 21, verse 13, and he said unto them, It is written, My house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Now, if you're not familiar with the record, that is the time when he overthrows the tables that the money changers had, and they just were in there basically scamming people. They would sell doves, things that would be offered in sacrifice, and they were unloading seconds, and passing them off as the top first fruits. But he called the temple the house of prayer. And because of that, churches today are often referred to as well as the house of prayer. Now the question is, does that mean that we should go to those churches to pray just like they went to the temple to pray? Because they went to the temple as a house of prayer all throughout the day. They went at 9 o'clock, they went at 6 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock, 12, 3, 6. All throughout the day there were hours of prayer that they went to the temple to pray. The day of Pentecost, everybody was there in the temple and they were praying. Later on in Acts chapter 4, Peter and John go into the temple at the hour of prayer. The temple was known as the hour of prayer, has the place of prayer, the house of prayer, the place that people went to pray, especially when they had a real need. We're going to look at some background about the temple and understand what it was, what its function was, and why it was always referred to as the house of prayer. And in doing so, we'll understand whether or not we should continue to look at modern day churches in that same light. Go to 1 Kings chapter 6, and we're going to look at some background to the temple. In 1 Kings chapter 6, in verse 1. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt. In the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he, Solomon, began to build the house of the Lord. The temple was built by Solomon. Solomon was the third of the kings over still a united kingdom of Israel and Judah. The first was Saul, then came his father David. And while David was king, he had it on his heart to build the temple, to build a house for God. One day, David looked around at his grand palace, and he said, well, something's not right here. I've got this great palace to live in, and God's still living in a tent. Because when they came out of Egypt, they had the tabernacle, which was similar to the temple, except it was just a temporary structure. It was just tent. The layout was much like the temple. And in that tabernacle, the innermost part of it, the Holy of Holies, contained the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was a place that most represented to Israel the presence of God. In the ark, there was the 2 stone tablets that Moses had received from the hand of God with the law on it. We'll get into some of this as we keep going. Go to 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 51. So Solomon built the temple. David wanted to, but God said, that's not for you to do because you've been such a man of war. And instead, Solomon, your son, will do it. And Solomon then began that in the 4th year of his reign, and he ends it in 1 Kings 7:51. So was ended all the work that King Solomon made for the house of the Lord. This is about 7 years later. About 7 years later, they finished building the house of the Lord. And that's what it's called, the house of the Lord. The temple is often referred to as the house of the Lord or just the house. Often it's just called the house, as it is on the day of Pentecost. And Solomon brought in the things which David his father had dedicated, even the silver and the gold and the vessels, did he put among the treasures of the house of the Lord. David was so excited, he said, well, if I can't build it, I can at least start gathering stuff to put in it. You know, we'll get all the furniture, we'll get all the decorations, we'll get all that stuff ready. So once it's built, we're ready to go. So it's built, and now they move all this stuff in. We're going to skip down. We're going to jump to 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 1. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, and all the heads of the tribes, all the leaders over Israel, the elders, the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. This day is the day of dedicating the temple. And after they've got everything in there and it's ready, now the most important thing is brought in, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Verse 9. There is nothing in the ark save the 2 tables of stone which Moses put there at Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. So in that ark of the covenant, the only thing in there were those 2 tables of stone. Verse 10. And it came to pass when the priests were come out of the holy place that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. Here God's presence is represented by this great cloud. Was God a cloud?
No.
We'll get there. But that cloud represented and showed to Israel that he was there. God did these things like a cloud, the pillar of a cloud that led them from Egypt to the promised land, the pillar of the fire by night which went before them in that trip. God did these things where his presence was made known in physical things because Israel, as a nation, did not have Holy Spirit. they could not communicate with God directly. And whenever God wanted to make his presence known to them, he had to come into concretion in some five senses form, because they were not spiritual. They only had the five senses to go by. That's the only way they could know anything. That's the only way they could understand anything. So God had to make his presence known in this very five senses way, because they had no spirit. They had no spiritual senses. In verse 14, and the king turned his face about. This is again the dedication. And so they've got the ark in there, and now the king turns to face the people. And blessed all the congregation of Israel. And all the congregation of Israel stood. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which spake with his mouth unto David my father, and with his hand fulfilled it. He first addresses the congregation of Israel in this dedication, and it's just kind of rehearsing for them how things went to come about to this day that the temple was completed. And then, after that, down in verse 22, we have the first prayer that's ever prayed in the temple. Verse 22. And Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel, and spread forth his hands toward heaven. And he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like thee, in heaven above or on earth beneath, who keepest covenant and mercy with thy servants that walk before thee with all their heart. Who hast kept with thy servant David, my father, that thou promised him. Thou spakest also with thy mouth, and hast fulfilled it with thine hand, as it is this day. So he begins by praising God and reminding and just sharing how faithful God has been to bring this to pass. He goes on in that prayer, we'll skip down to verse 27, to talk about the temple and how this will be a house of prayer. In verse 27, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee, how much less this house that I have builded. The temple that they were calling the house of the Lord, they knew, Solomon knew, and Solomon shared it with all the congregation, that certainly this wasn't literally the house of the Lord. This wasn't where God lived, you know. If you wanted to send him a letter, that you addressed it to God at 27 whatever avenue, the temple. That's not the way it was. But that he could not be contained with the heavens and the earth. But this was the place that people would go to seek his presence, to come to his presence to make request in prayer. And that's what he says. Verse 28, Yet have thou respect unto the prayer of thy servant, and to his supplication, O Lord my God, to hearken unto the cry and to the prayer, that thou mayest hearken unto the prayer which thy servant shall make toward this place. We know you don't live here. This is not really your house. But God, hear our prayers that we make into this place, and grant them. Verse 30. And hearken thou to the supplication of thy servant, and of thy people Israel, when they shall pray toward this place, and hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and when thou hearest, forgive. And he goes on. When your people come to this place and pray, hear us. And even if they can't come to the place, because they were scattered out throughout the whole land of Israel, when they face this place and make prayer, hear those prayers. Hear those prayers. Many of these, it goes on to in the next verses talk about different times that they would pray. And that God would hear these prayers and answer them. And time and again, the times that he's talking about is when Israel and the people in it had done something wrong. And they would come and they would pray for God's forgiveness. And when they got in trouble because they did do something wrong and they wanted help, that God would hear them and deliver them. Look at verse 35. When heaven is shut up and there is no rain, at times of famine, at times where it hasn't rained and now there's a famine in the land and people pray, he goes on to say, hear their prayers and bring them what they need. Verse 37, if there be in the land famine, if there be pestilence, blasting, mildew, locust, or if there be caterpillar, before they become those beautiful butterflies, and they're just eating up the crops, and all these things he's talking about, locusts and mildew and so forth, all things that would be hurting their harvest, all things that would be hurting their livelihood, literally taking the food out of their mouth. At those times when Israel has those kind of hardships, which only happened because they had strayed, but when they came back to God and made those requests in prayer at the temple or toward it, hear those prayers and grant them. Whatsoever goes on, if their enemy besiege them, verse 37, in the land of their cities, whatsoever plague, whatsoever sickness there be, what prayer and supplication soever be made by any man, or by all thy people Israel, which shall know every man the plague of his own heart, and spread forth his hands toward this house, then hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and forgive and do, and give to every man according to his ways, whose heart thou knowest. For thou, even thou only, knowest the hearts of the children of men, that they may fear thee in all their ways, that they live in the land which thou gavest unto our fathers. Anybody that comes and prays, that you would hear those prayers. It goes on later in the chapter to talk about even the stranger, even those that were not of Israel, is somebody that from another country who are not your people would hear about this place and would come and pray that you would hear their prayers. Later on in the chapter, it talks about at some time, if Israel ends up being taken captive, which they did, and they, in that land that they've been carried off to, would turn and face their land and this place and make prayer, that you would hear those prayers, that you would soften the hearts of their captors, that you would take care of them even when they're hundreds of miles away now, that you still would hear them when they remember you and remember and pray towards this place. And that someday you would hear their prayers and return them to this place. That was the prayer. They were taken captive. They were taken captive by the Babylonians. And at the time that happened, Nebuchadnezzar, that led the armies of the Babylonians, destroyed that temple, burnt it to the ground, destroyed it so that it could never be rebuilt again. A new one would have to be built. That temple of Solomon was so magnificent, so incredible, and it was destroyed in 586 BC, and then it was built again beginning in 536 BC and completed in 516 BC. So 50 to 70 years later it takes some time. It takes some time because they've been taken out of the land. And they begin to be able to come back. And they're doing, a lot of things are happening as they're rebuilding. That temple that they rebuild, or build again, is known as the Temple of Zerubbabel. And he was the governor at that time that did it. You have a couple of prophets, Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as Zephaniah and Haggai, that all speak at these times over that period of time, encouraging the work, giving them instruction, things that have to happen. One of the things that they have to deal with that slows the work down is when they come back to the land, some that were left in the land of Samaria who ended up mixing in with other people from the Assyrian and Babylonians, and they came there and they mix in, and now these guys are kind of a mix of some true beliefs and a lot of the false beliefs, a lot of the idolatry that came from those people that were moved into the land from their conquering nations. So it becomes a bit of a mess in Samaria. And it's why in the gospel times the Samaritans were looked down on, because they were often considered just half Jews, and they were suspect in terms of their beliefs. Eventually the Samaritans come up with their own Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. They come up with a slightly changed version of the first 5 books of the Bible. And not only that, but when Zerubbabel and the men come in and they begin building the temple, these guys want to share in the building. Sounds like a great thing, right? But because they are at the same time people who are worshiping false gods and idols, they're not allowed to participate. Well, they're not happy about that. This offends them. And so they fight against that rebuilding process. They fight against them, and that goes on for a long time. And when they can't beat them, they decide, well, fine, we're just going to build our own temple then, and it'll be better than your old temple. So they build their own temple, the Samaritans, and they built it in Mount Gerizim, or Gerizim, I believe is the right way it's said. That comes to play in John chapter 4. That Samaritan temple eventually is also destroyed, and as is the temple of Zerubbabel, although that one's not destroyed so much that it cannot be rebuilt. And Herod rebuilds it and builds it much grander than it had been built by Zerubbabel and during that second temple time. Okay? All of that's backdrop to this record in John 4, verse 5. Then cometh he, Jesus, to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Verse 7. Then cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said unto her, Give me to drink. So Jesus has been on a long journey. He comes to a place in Samaria named Sychar. And he's tired, he's thirsty, and this woman comes to him that is a Samaritan, and he asked her to give him a drink. And that surprises her, because not only under certain circumstances would men talk to women at all, but especially a Samaritan. And so they have this wonderful conversation where Jesus witnesses to her. And it's one of the greatest records to really look at in terms of what he does and what he says, and that whole standpoint of just sharing the word with somebody. But we're going to pick up in the kind of middle of this in verse 19. After he's told her some things, the woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, pointing at that mountain Gerizim. And ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. We had a temple here, and that's where our fathers, the Samaritans, worshipped. And that's where we continue to pray towards. Whenever we want to make prayer, we do it facing that mountain. And we worship God facing that mountain, representing where the temple had been. Just like when Judah was in captivity, they prayed toward where that temple, the Temple of Solomon, had been. But you say that Jerusalem's the place. Jesus said unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain, where the Samaritans prayed to the Samaritan temple, nor yet at Jerusalem, where the temple that now Herod had built, where that existed, neither one of those places is the place where you will worship the Father. Verse 22. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. You can see by that comment that the Samaritans still had a very contaminated doctrine. They didn't know what they were worshiping. They didn't know who the true God really was. They understood in Judah who the true God was. But the hour cometh, verse 23, and now is when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. God is spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. It's not about where. It's not about worshiping in the temple or praying in the temple. It's not about worshiping or praying in the churches today. Those places, all of that was replaced by something so much greater. Look at Hebrews chapter 9. Speaking of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of the temple service that was done with the high priest representing for the people all of their sacrifices, all of their requests, all their petitions, their prayers, that he would make those to God. And he would do especially this once a year when he actually went into the Holy of Holies. That's what it says in verse 7. But into the second, the innermost part, the high priest alone, once every year, not without blood or the sacrifices, which he offered for himself and for the heirs of the people, the Holy Ghost thus signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing. That first tabernacle is not referring to the temporary tent version of the temple, but it's referring to the tabernacle within the temple where was the Holy of Holies. And so long as that was standing, so long as that was still what was to be done, then the great fulfillment of it had not come. Verse 9. Which, that Holy of Holies, that innermost part where the presence of God was said to have been sought, was a figure for the time then present, in which were kept both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect, as pertaining to the conscience. Verse 11. But Christ, being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. Those things, including, and most especially in this context, the temple. the temple that was made with hands. That could never really accomplish what man was seeking after. The high priest would go in there to the Holy of Holies where only he could go. Only he could go to be in the very presence of God. The rest of the congregation could go. Normal priests can go in there. Certainly not every old person in Israel. None of them could get that close to God. They could be in the outer part, but they could never truly be in his presence, even though it was called the house of God. Kind of like I felt at that time. They could never really be in his presence. Verse 24. For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Verse 28. So Christ once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. Back when we were looking at the verses about the temple has the place of prayer. And I pointed out that so often when it spoke of those prayers, it spoke about the need to have forgiveness before they could receive the answers to those prayers. And so they had these different sacrifices, and so they would pray, and they would have the special day, the Day of Atonement, where once a year that high priest went in to seek God's presence in that very personal way. But all of that was done away with. All of that was just a figure of what was to come. It was a foreshadowing. It was a type. It was teaching them what Jesus Christ would do, what he would fulfill. And he did it once and for all. No longer a need to do it all the time, year after year. But Jesus Christ did it one time when he didn't go into the temple, but into the heavens themselves to make intercession for us. Jesus Christ makes intercession for us. Our prayers don't go through some high priest. Our prayers go through Jesus Christ. They go through Jesus Christ. And he doesn't need us to go to a temple or a church or any such thing. It talks about in Ephesians chapter 2 as well as other places. It says that we, in verse 22, are built together for a habitation of God through the Spirit. We are now God's dwelling place. We are the temple. That's what it says. That we are the temple, we are the tabernacle, that we are God's habitation. Can you go to a church to pray? Sure. Do you need to? No. Wherever you are, God is there. Because you are God's habitation. You can pray in your living room. You can pray in the garage. You can pray anytime and every time. You can pray as you're driving down the street. In fact, I highly recommend it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wherever you are, God is. And so that is the place of prayer because you are the house of God, the house of prayer. God bless you.